Hello, everyone. Welcome to Recipe for Reality, small bites where I take a topic pertaining to the most recent Survivor episode that has just aired and give you a list or a ranking or a top 10 based on that topic. I wasn't sure what the topic was going to be headed into episode 3 of Survivor 46, but sadly, due to the medevac of a certain player, which I will not spoil now in case you haven't watched it, go watch that episode and then come back because, spoiler alert, that person does appear on this list as well. After seeing that, I knew what topic I wanted to do, which was top 10 medevacs who deserve another shot. And I say another shot because some of these contestants have already had a second shot, and they would be getting a third shot just due to the outcomes of the list. I'll be honest, Survivor has done a pretty good job in giving a lot of people who have been medevaced a chance to play again. There have been 6 medevacs that have come back into future seasons and been given another shot to play the game, and there are, I believe, 12 that have not. And when I say medevac, I mean evacuated due to a medical circumstance, whether it be themselves getting medically evacuated or maybe, spoiler alert, a family member with a medical emergency that you have to be evacuated to tend to. So anything that kind of fits in the medical evacuation banner. This is not going to include quits. Like Dana from the Philippines, she did decide to leave the game because she couldn't handle it. There was one person on this list that I think some people would consider a quit, but let's be honest, his arm was shattered in a million pieces. So Matthew is going to be on this top 10 list. He's the one exception of that quit rule, whereas everyone else was like physically pulled from the game. The doctor said you have to come out of the game for one reason or the other. But as I was saying before, I mean, Survivor has done a good job giving players another shot. Now, there are 12 people who deserve another shot, and there are 6 that we've seen get another shot, and I might be missing 1 or 2 down the line. I tried to go through every single episode or every single season and really looked at all the different players. Let's rattle off the few, though, that have gotten a second chance, just so I can kind of articulate why I think it's so important that they do get a second chance. And looking at one of the earlier examples, I mean, Jonathan Penner on Fans vs. Favorites was such a big presence on that season and got pulled right before the merge phase of the game. He was kind of at the late swap phase. He was an important figure on that season because he was trying to go against the opposition. You know, he wasn't necessarily in the majority, but he was trying to make big moves against big players. And I think if he had gone to the merge with Parvati and Sari and Amanda, I think he could have really shook up the game. Whereas I think the favorites that made it to the merge with them, people like Ozzy, like James, were part of that contingent and kind of worked alongside them. Whereas I think Penner would have shook things up. And that's what we see on Survivor Philippines when he returns. He shakes things up. It doesn't go particularly well for him, but he does make a deep run there. And then the other person I mentioned is James, who got medevac for his finger in Micronesia. Micronesia, really heartbreaking medevacs for the favorites. Now, James did come back again and didn't do well because he injured himself again with a leg injury, though he did survive a tribal when he did have his injury. So I'm going to allow him to stay off of this list for those purposes because he technically did get a second chance after his finger injury, which is the real injury that pulled him from the game. Another person who returned on the Philippines season is Russell Swan, who had a very heartbreaking collapse during Survivor Samoa. Thankfully, he was okay. He played on Survivor Philippines, didn't go so well only because his tribe was kind of the complete opposite of his Samoa tribe. They just kept losing and losing and losing to where he was kind of the last resort option for Denise and Malcolm to boot. But I do think it's great that they let Russell Swan have another go because he's someone who didn't change up his game style, but still, if he had been on a winning tribe, would have probably succeeded in a similar way that he was on Galu in Survivor Samoa. It's just he was dealt a pretty poor hand. There's also another medevac who returned on Survivor Philippines, but I'm not going to mention his name for the sake of keeping my channel friendly and positive and not bringing up any negativity here. So there's another name that I'm sure you're all wondering what I think about them, and my omission of them from this overall conversation should give you enough intel on what I do think of them. Speaking of more recent medevacs, I mean, Caleb from Korong was a very scary one, probably the scariest medevac we've seen, where he literally almost died from heat stroke, and they brought him back on Game Changers, and he was a dud. But hey, you never know if they're going to be a dud until you give them that shot. And Game Changers was tough because he went into it with a pre-existing relationship with Ty, and he seemed almost laser focused on working with Ty and not really wanting to explore many other options, which kind of bit him in the butt. And I think because of his reputation on Big Brother, I think people know that he can go far in these games. So I think Caleb's an interesting case. And then most recently we had Bruce, who got a immediate shot to come back the very next season, which I think that is the sole reason why you should give Medevacs another chance, because Bruce, on his first season, we got very little, obviously. He was Medevac before the first challenge was even done. He got injured before the first challenge was even done, and Medevac before the second challenge even began. But we saw his return on 45 was so entertaining. He is one of the figureheads of that season. Love him or hate him, I mean, some people were annoyed by him, but he brought so much entertainment with him and Katora, their little feud. So I think you needed Bruce on Survivor 45 to add to that season's charm, and we wouldn't have gotten that if Jeff didn't give him a second chance. So I think Bruce and Jonathan Penner and even Russell Swan are reasons why I think Medevacs have shown, even if they don't win the game, I think we get to see how they would have played out a full season. You know, it's really nice to see. And I know we saw Jonathan Penner play out a full season on Cook Islands, but having this reputation of being Jonathan Penner, the Survivor vet, seeing him play again on Philippines is really cool. So there are 12 names that I've been circulating around. There are 2 names that I left off the list, and honestly, it's just due to age because I don't necessarily think they're going to come back, and that is Bruce from Panama, who I don't think is going to come back. I think he's too old at this point. Plus, I think of all the Medevacs, he's probably the most forgettable character nowadays, at least, unless you're like one of those people like me who rewatches the seasons constantly. I think a lot of the common folk don't necessarily remember Panama for Bruce as much as they remember the bigger figures like Suri and Aris and Terry and Shane and Courtney, and even like some of the earlier boots like Timbertina or Ruth Murray. I don't think people necessarily remember Bruce as much, but Bruce, I like Bruce. I just think he's too old to return. And then same with Joe Del Campo from Ko-Rong. Don't worry, there is a Ko-Rong name on this list because Ko-Rong did have 3 Medevacs, but Joe is someone that I just don't think would play again. And if he were to, I don't think he would play any differently. He went deep in the game, so we kind of know where it would have ended. He probably would have been a 0-vote finalist alongside Aubrey and Ty. And honestly, Joe's Medevac is the reason why Michelle won, essentially, because him going out led Michelle to her path of victory, essentially. So I like to say that Joe forever changed the landscape of Survivor history, because if Joe survives, there's a good chance that we see Aubrey, Joe, and Ty in the finals, depending on, of course, what immunities Michelle wins or doesn't win. But again, the game can change. Even immunity challenges can change if there's another person in the game. It could just give you a different mindset going into it of who your competition is. So who's to say what that season would have been if he wasn't Medevac? But I didn't put him on this list just because he is old, and I just don't think he would want to play again. He was old already when he competed the first time, and it's been quite some years since. But let's start off the top 10 with a contestant that I don't really want to see back, but I did put Joe Dowdle at number 10. I mean, I like Joe. I think he's nice. I think he's a nice guy. I think he was memorable for his showmance and for being just a strong guy on a tribe that kind of lost more than it won. But I think the problem with Joe is that he was overshadowed by so many big personalities of his season, even personalities that aren't necessarily huge personalities normally, were big personalities because of the context of the season, like Brendan or like JT. I mean, they've kind of had his archetype, but kind of exceeded that archetype of that, like, just good old guy, average Joe, if you will. Whereas I think JT showed that he's more than just the average Joe, and he kind of shone a little bit brighter than Joe did on that tribe. And then you have bigger characters on that season, like Coach, like Tyson, like Steven Fishback, like Taj. I mean, Aaron, Sierra. I think he's just competing with a really hard cast, where I don't think anybody thinks of Joe in the first 5 names they think about when they think about Token Teens. But given that he was, on a tribe with JT and Steven, like, I really would like to see if he did survive and he did make it to the merge, because he did make the merge, but if he made it through the first merge vote and actually got to stay in the game, would he have stuck with that majority, and would he be in the end game? And I think there's a good chance for it. I don't think Joe is an immediate target. So I would like to see Joe back maybe for that reason, but of all the names, he's probably the least person I want to see back just because I don't have any passionate feeling toward Joe. Number 9, we have another person that I don't think will come back. I don't really want to see come back, but it would definitely make for an interesting redemption arc. I think it would be almost like a Bruce thing of, like, would he play this kind of boisterous game, or would he be more likable? And it is Shamar from Survivor Karamoan, who got medevac for getting sand in his eye. And I think the reason Shamar is on more radars is because Tim from this current season listed Shamar as the player he was most like. And I don't know if it was a joke or if he was genuinely being serious. Unfortunately, we haven't seen much of Tim on the season yet to kind of assess that, but I don't know. Shamar's name has kind of been circulating because of that. I feel like this could be the time to bring him back. I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of, grasping at straws here. Is that the phrase, grasping at straws? I don't even know what the phrase is, but Shamar would at least be entertaining. I mean, he was definitely a villainous figure, even though he was this noble serviceman. I mean, he definitely was an antagonistic figure on the season, which, as we've seen from certain seasons, is kind of fun. I mean, you see it with Bruce. You see it even with, like, Russell Swan at times in Philippines, like this kind of person who is kind of thinks he's in charge but doesn't do as much as he thinks he does for the tribe and kind of rubs people the wrong way. I think that would be interesting to see Shamar play again for that reason, but I really don't think he would. I don't think much of the audience is really, begging for him to come back, but because he is at least of the age where he probably could, I by default put him on this list. And now the top 8 is like legitimately 8 people that I would like to see again, that I think like would actually do something with another chance. And at number 8, just because of the wonky situation in which they went out, I did put Jackson. From Survivor 42. Now, Jackson didn't get Medevac because of an injury, more so because of his meds, and I really don't know if Jackson would be able to compete again because of this whole medical situation. I don't think him and production are in good graces because of it, but I do think Jackson is important for many reasons. First, being the only openly trans person on the show at the time his season aired, whereas Zeke was obviously outed during the show. Zeke didn't go on the show publicly out as transgender, whereas Jackson did, so Jackson has that like kind of notoriety in the Survivor community as the first to do that, and I hope he opens the door for many more in the future to come. So I would like to see Jackson be able to like kind of fulfill the representation that Survivor wants and kind of like be that face for so many people to rally against, rally for, I should say. But I do think just in terms of gameplay, I don't really think Jackson was going to get very far in that game. It seemed like he was almost a little too kind and sweet and like not hard, not cutthroat or hard-edged enough to kind of compete with some of the more dominating personalities, because that tribe was pretty dominant. I mean, you had Omer, who was very, very high on strategy, and then Jonathan, who was this big hulking muscle man, and Marianne, who was a big personality, Lindsay, who was, a great Survivor player. So I think Jackson wouldn't have necessarily made it too far on that season regardless, which is why I didn't put him higher on this list, but I would like to see him again just because I feel like he got shortchanged. And then the next 3 contestants kind of follow the path of Jackson and the fact that they were all Medevac in the first episode or first few episodes, to where they didn't really get a chance to even go to a tribal council or even get the chance to play. And the next name I have is Randon from this most recent season. Now, Randon obviously made it further in the game than Jackson and some of the other people I'm going to have after him, but he did go out of the game before his tribe could even go to tribal council. So we really don't know where Randon truly stood with his tribe and where his actual placement was. I don't think Randon's the most exciting personality, which is why I have him this low as number 7, but because of recency bias and because he did find the Beware advantage and he did have an alliance with Venus, like he was playing the game. And I really think Randon could have been a really interesting figure on the game, because preseason he was hyping himself up as the potential first boot. He was like, yeah, my family thinks I'm going to get the first boot, I'm going to be out first, yada, 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 where I think so many people were low on him in preseason press, but I think actually he would have actually cruised probably pretty successfully through the game should he have found that idol and should he have gotten some more numbers to work with Venus. Let's say he gets like Tevin or Hunter or Liz to flip on someone like Soda or one of their own. I think Randon could have a deep shot at this game, because I also don't think he's very confrontational. Now, the problem is, I think that leads to him being a little bit bland for television, where I don't necessarily know if he's going to be number 1 on the list to return. But similar to Bruce, actually, and even Jackson, which I just talked about, I think Randon just never really got the chance to play. So I think because we didn't get to see him fulfill the promise of the Beware advantage and the alliance with Venus, like I would like to see him get another shot, even though I think the 6 personalities above him on the list are bigger personalities in general, which takes us to number 6, who is a huge personality who was also taken out before he could even go to tribal council in the very first episode, which is Pat Cusack from David vs. Goliath. Now, Pat, I don't think was necessarily the greatest player. I think already he was looked at as a target for his tribe. Like, I really do think Nick was the target in that first boot if they were to go to tribal council, but I really think Pat was also circulated as a name and was only really kept around, or was going to be kept around, due to strength and due to helping out at camp. But there is something to say about Pat being basically the inspiration for the season itself. David vs. Goliath, they had this guy Pat, and they were like, what a great theme to build around this player, essentially, like the idea of a David and a Goliath and who you identify with in your everyday life and the kind of work ethics you have. And a lot of it, Jeff Probst has said, was inspired by Pat and his story. And I think it was so unfortunate that the player, of any player, I mean, it's unfortunate when any player gets Medevac, but of all the players to get Medevac, Pat being the one to get Medevac kind of really almost threw the season for a loop. Now, luckily, there were so many great players that kind of fulfilled on the promise of the season, like Christian, like Angelina, like at the time, Nick Wilson, but, that's another story for another time. But like Davey and like John Hennigan and Allison and Kara, like there were so many great personalities. Alec, so many great personalities on that season to where I think they, obviously didn't lose at all with Pat, but I think Pat would have also been a huge personality. I would have liked to see how far he got in the game. I think he still would have been a pre-merge boot, maybe around the swap era. But I really like Pat, and I think he's just someone that is so unfortunate because he didn't even get injured in a challenge. He got injured in the boat ride from the challenge to camp, and that's just an unfortunate circumstance. The waves were too heavy. He was sitting in a way that something with his vertebrae was a little off. Something happened in his back, and he had to go. I mean, it's really unfortunate, and I think that's why Pat deserves another chance. And at number 5, I have someone who's in a very similar boat, no pun intended, which is Courtney Moon from One World. Actually, the only woman to actually be medevac from the game. Dana quit the game on Philippines due to a severe headache fever thing, but Courtney is the only person to be medevaced of all the women in Survivor US. So I think there's something to be said about that. I think it would make for a cool story. Also because she was so young at the time, and she was kind of meek and small, and I would really like to see her with some more years experience just play a game and get to come on. Because, let's be honest, of all this list, I think Courtney's the least threatening if she were to return. Whereas at least I think Pat comes with a reputation. Even Randon comes with a reputation, having found that Beware advantage. Whereas I think Courtney, all she's remembered for in Survivor history is falling and breaking her arm in that challenge. I really do think Courtney is someone who could really be exciting, and someone that we could see a real evolution in if she were to return. Also because she played on a season, not for long, but she played on a season with Kim Spradlin, who's the greatest woman to win the game. And I'll stand by that. My favorite player is Parvati. I love Suri, but I think Kim played the best singular game of Survivor in the history of Survivor. So I think there's a lot she can learn just from watching her season and coming in with more experience, to where I'd really like to see her get another shot. So of all these players that went out either in the first episode or before they went to Tribal, people like Jackson, like Randon, like Pat, I think Courtney is my favorite of all those to return for those reasons, because I think she has, honestly, the most potential in the game. But now the top 4, these are the heavy 4 favorites. These are the 4 that I really want to see play again. One of them, who is here at number 4, is someone who made it all the way to the finale and then got medevaced. They were so close to winning the season. If they're able to take out Cochran and make it to the final 3, I think there's a chance they win, and that's Eric Reichenbach from Survivor Caramon. Now, a lot of people who watched the show would probably say Eric didn't have a shot at winning because his edit was so bad, but I think the reason his edit was so bad is because he was medevac. He was not really an endgame player, and his biggest ally, Brenda, is the person that they decided to focus on more. It's really unfortunate what happened to Eric, and I think this is kind of one of those cases where I think if you were to get Eric an IV and keep him in a room for 5 or 6 hours, I think you could have brought him back into the game. I hate that there's a rule that, you have to pull someone from the game and don't give them any time to recoup and get back in. But I get it. Once you give them IVs and water, is it fair to bring them back? Also because it was so close to the end of the game and they weren't necessarily sure what was wrong with him. But it was really just dehydration, and it's a shame because I feel like everyone else has either broken a bone or there's been an infection. Whereas Eric, it was just dehydration and just kind of being malnourished, and that's something where I feel like if Survivor were to just say, hey, we're going to give you IVs, we're going to give you water, we're going to give you food, let's also give the rest of the other 4 people that and get everyone on the same page, and then let's play the last few days. I would have loved them to see them do that, but at that point when it's the final 5 and the game is so close to the end, it's you know what, let's just send him to jury. But it is really a shame because Eric Reichenbach, I think, is one of the more underrated players of the game. I don't think he's a great player, but I think he's underrated because everyone remembers the one move where he gives away the necklace. But he was a fan going up against 3 of the most beloved favorites of all time, Parvati, Suri, and Amanda, so you cannot fault him in that. And his second season, he does a very good job. I mean, he's not necessarily on the majority of all the votes, but he slithers by to where at the end game, like I mentioned, if he's able to win that final immunity or 2 and cut Cochran, I think if he's sitting in the end with Eddie and Sherry, he wins hands down. If he's sitting at the end with Eddie and Dawn, I still think he has a good shot because I don't think Dawn had the jury respect. And if he's with Dawn and Sherry, I think it's the same way that Cochran won. I think he wins in a landslide. So I really think it's one of those case scenarios where if Eric is able to cut Cochran at the end, Eric probably wins that season. And I think it's a shame because the edit doesn't show any of Eric's game because he didn't end up being that player because he got medevaced. And I do think if there's a world where Eric doesn't get medevaced and goes on to be an endgame player in the final 4 or final 3 or even win the game, we'd obviously see more of his game throughout. So I think there's just a lot of game we didn't see from Eric, but obviously he navigates the game well because he makes it all the way to final 5 only to be sniped out by his own dehydration. So I really think Eric is someone who is due for another go because like Courtney, I think he has a lot to gain with more experience. I think between the 5 years from Micronesia to Karamoan, he had already grown so much. And imagine him growing now even more 10 years later, 20 seasons later. We're now at 46. It has been 10 years since Survivor Karamoan. Eric is 10 years older, and he's 15 years older than he was when he gave away that necklace. I mean, imagine how cool of a story that would be if Eric came back and actually won the game this time, or at least got to the end in a fair way that didn't involve, dehydration or anything like that, or in a way that was not stupid, like giving away the idol. I don't know. Eric's one of my favorites to watch, and I really, really wish they would bring him back. I think at this point, it's a little unlikely that we'll ever see Eric play Survivor again. The only saving grace is if they do like a legendary type season where they want to feature Eric because of that big move he made in giving away that necklace. That is legendary moment in Survivor. It is perhaps the most legendary moment of Survivor. So I think Eric has a case there to come back. At number 3, I have someone from Co Wrong, the cursed season where Joe went down, where Caleb went down. This person also went down in a very unusual way, which was Neil. This kind of took everyone by surprise. I mean, everyone was kind of getting bitten up and infected and all that stuff. And Neil just kind of, at the merge, the doctor was like, yeah, we got to pull you. This is going to, spread to a joint in your knee, which was very unfortunate because I think Neil was one of the biggest gamers of that season. Neil and Aubrey were working side by side, and I really do think if Neil stays in the game, kind of similar to what I said about Joe, I think there's a good chance that maybe Neil goes on a bit of a run similar to what Aubrey had. Now, the thing is, if Neil had stayed, Aubrey probably would have gone at the merge. So I don't necessarily think Neil and Aubrey would have made it all the way to the end, but I think if Aubrey had gone out in the merge, I think Neil could have had a similar path that Aubrey did in getting to the end. And if Neil gets to the end, I think he's a good enough talker that he could probably get some votes, especially because he seemingly hated Michelle out there. So he would have been able to give her a run for her money. And who's to say if he would have won immunities or what have you, found more advantages. He had an idol, and he went out with an idol in his pocket. And I think that just goes to show you everything you need to know about Neil. He is a solid Survivor player who's just screwed because of his infection. And I really do think, this is a guy who left the game with an idol in his pocket. I mean, it's similar to what Colton did in One World, even though Colton apparently didn't have anything wrong with him, so I didn't put him on this list. But it's kind of that deal where he didn't really share it with his ally Aubrey, but it did lead to Aubrey kind of having this underdog run to the end. Which is really fun to see. And then Neil, of course, getting, voted off the jury by Michelle and having those amazing final words to Michelle. I mean, I think he's just a great character as well, which is why I would love to see someone like Neil back on the show, because I think he showed strategic prowess, he showed social prowess, but most importantly, he was an entertaining person, an entertaining character. And I think he would be really fun to watch on a return. Also because I don't think he's going to come into the game with a super big threat level the way, someone like Penner did, or someone like Russell Swan, or even Caleb did. I think, Neil would come into the game, honestly, with no reputation at all to really worry about. So I would love to see Neil back. At number 2 is The Stretch from earlier. Like I said, he did technically decide to leave the game, but he did leave the game because of the fact that his arm was shattered in so many pieces, and that is Matthew from Survivor 44. Listen, I know a lot of people would say he's a quitter, he's not a medevac, but the thing is, if he had made it 1 or 2 or 3 more days, still doing the stuff he was doing out there and being in the challenges and like putting all that stress on that arm, there's a good chance he would have gotten medevaced eventually. I think he just kind of left before he could get medevaced, before it got too serious. But the truth is with Matthew, he is, by far, of this whole top 10, the best player on the list. I mean, he was doing things in the first few weeks of Survivor that were something you would see in the later game of another season. I mean, he was finding idols, he was playing a shot in the dark so he didn't have to get any blood on his hands. It was a defensive move, and then he hid the fake idol for Jamie to find right before the tribe swap to then get more intel on that. I really think Matthew played one of the better pre-merge games we've seen of any pre-merger, really. And I think if he makes the merge, he might be a target, but honestly, because of his arm, he might have had a Tyson thing where Tyson in Blood vs. Water, because he had been kind of air quote hurt during his season, people didn't necessarily think of him as a big physical threat, so maybe he would have made it further in the game. But I think if anyone was going to give the Tika 3 a run for their money that season, it would have been Matthew had we hit the merge, because Matthew would have had Lauren, would have had Jamie, would have had Brandon, and really could have made a dent. Would have had Kane on his side probably could have pulled over Josh if Josh gets there. I really do think Matthew was such an interesting player. And it's a shame he went out so early. And I think it's also because they made him such a big character that season as well. And how can you not when you are such a big personality? So I think Matthew has the recipe for everything. The only thing about Matthew is that he did do it to himself. He was stupid in climbing that rock. And I do see how production might be a little pissed off about it and be like, no, this guy's not coming back. He did it to himself. He's a dumbass. But I really do think Matthew, in terms of a game, promise and potential, I think Matthew is someone who needs a second chance because he is someone that I think is one of the more interesting strategists of this modern era, at least in terms of a pre-merge. I don't know how he would have been in a merge, but I think he would have brought a lot of entertainment nonetheless. At number one, though, is someone that I was so excited to see back when they got a second chance. And then they went out in the game right when they were starting to figure out their game, and that is Terry Dietz in Cambodia. Now, this is another one where some people might say this is not a medevac, but technically he was evacuated from the game because his son had a medical emergency. That is a medical evacuation, whether or not it was his own medical emergency or someone else's. He was pulled from the game. He wasn't given the option. He wasn't told, well, you can stay if you want. No, Jeff said, you're getting pulled from the game. We're pulling you from the game because your wife needs you home. Your son is hurt. Or your son is going into surgery or something. I don't remember all the details behind that, but Terry is an interesting case because Terry's original season, a lot of people would say he's not the best player. He just had to win out. And that's true. I mean, he kept having to win because the second he loses, he plays the idol. And then the second he loses again, he goes home. But the thing with Terry on that season, though, is that because that season was so full of such crazy personalities, Terry himself is a bit of a villain, but because he was going up against people like Shane and he had that rivalry with Aris and even Suri, like people looked at him as this like Captain America figure. But I think that's what makes Terry so fascinating is that he really wasn't the nicest guy at times. He was, had an ego and he was cocky, but he had the right to be because he was winning all those challenges. So I think Terry is someone who's very interesting and a very old school mentality player, almost similarly to like a Penner or a James or even a Bruce in the way that he is a little domineering at times, but he's kind of earned that right because he's so good at what he does and winning all those immunities, only for him to come back and kind of be thrown for a loop in this new modern new school game where he was struggling to keep up at first and he was like, am I even cut out for this? But then he had finally started to wake up and say like, oh, this is what I have to do. I have to make these bonds. I have to do this strategy. I have to do this, yada yada yada. And then again, he gets pulled from the game. And I think someone like Terry is so interesting because these old school players who play on new school seasons, you always have a risk with them. Are they going to adapt? And we saw with Kelly Wigglesworth from Borneo, she didn't really adapt too well. She was well positioned, she was well liked, but she wasn't like driving any of the strategy, at least as far as we saw. But then you have people like Jervis on Blood vs. Water, where him and Tyson were actively parts of a lot of the strategy. Now Tyson more so than Jervis, but you know what I mean. Even like Kimmy Kappenberg on Cambodia, even He Who Must Not Be Named from Cambodia and Game Changers still showed a drive in the game and an energy that you wouldn't expect from an old school player. And I think someone like Rob Cesternino, for example, would be a great person to kind of show that old school to new school shift. And I think Terry was someone who was struggling at first, but was originally not necessarily wanting to play the new school game, but was finally adapting to it. And I think if he were to come back yet again, I think he would have learned from his second chance and said, you know what, I came into the game wanting to play the same game, and I know I can't do that, so I'm going to be more strategic this time. I'm going to make more bonds. I'm going to be a little bit more sneaky and strategic, and I think it would be a lot of fun to see him back. Also because he's older, so the chances of him winning immunity after immunity after immunity are very rare, but he's still in good shape where I think it would be fun to see him win immunity after immunity. So there's another chance where we might see another great immunity run out of him. And I know a lot of people don't love when people just keep winning immunities back to back to back to back with like people like Culpepper or people like Ozzy or Mike Holloway, but if it's someone like Terry, who has been like this kind of figure in Survivor history of the greatest challenge competitor to never get a second chance, and then getting the second chance, having it short-sighted, I think he just has such a cool story behind him to where I would really like to see him get a third chance, technically a second chance, because his second chance didn't get to see the full fruition. And there's a chance, who knows, maybe Terry does flop, but hey, I would love to see that chance. And of all these players, I would love to see Terry back because I think he was also given the rawest deal because, hey, Matthew climbed that rock. He decided to climb that rock. Neil, he made it to the merge. We got to see his game. Eric Reichenbach, we've seen him make it to the finale. But Terry, I don't think we've seen his full potential, and I would love to see him on a newer school season. I don't necessarily know how likely it is, but if anyone is going to come back of this list. I do think production would love to see Terry back. I think production would love to see Matthew back, assuming they're not mad at him for climbing that rock. And I do think they would like to see Eric back. I don't necessarily think the chances are high for everyone else. Maybe Randon, because it's so recent. But yeah, that is my list. So let me know down below, of these Medevacs, who would you like to see back? Who would you not like to see back? And please do not mention the Medevac from the Australian Outback in the comments. If you do, I'll probably just ignore it anyway. But yep, that's my list. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned. Can't wait for another great episode of Survivor tonight to see what topic I'll be covering for next week on Recipe for Reality Small Bites. If you want to check out the main Recipe for Reality show, where Zach and I cover different topics in reality television like Survivor, Big Brother, etc., you can check that out on the main channel on the Dill Pickle Movie Network. Otherwise, that is it from me. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.